The first encounter with psychedelics. An unknown dose of 2C-E, probably in excess of 20 milligrams. Edit. My friend just told me I also had an unknown amount of JWH-018 methinks that night. Apparently the 2C-E dose was really high, in excess of 35 milligrams. Sorry for the late clarifications. Maybe this further explains the very shamanistic experiences that I haven't quite got recreated with 2C-E later on. This might turn into a bit of a rambling and long post, so bear with me. I decided to write down my thoughts and feelings of the first ever stronger psychedelic encounter I've had, before new ones appear, just to give a different kind of an angle to psychoactive substances. I am quite sure I might think differently of this later on, but here goes. The setting and start. That day I arrived to a psytrance festival held in a forest. Having a good deal of alcohol and ganja under me, I was searching for any digestible drugs that wouldn't come with a price tag or heavy addiction. So I was given half a litre bottle of water with 2C-E in it. I'm not sure of the exact dosage. I think someone more experienced had taken one trip off the bottle, so that it had a little over half of the water left. I drank most of the rest. Looking at information and reports of 2C-E, I could guess the dosage was around 30 milligrams. The first outworld contact. At about 30 minutes in, I got a slight stomachache. I felt a bit like puking, although not excessively. I had felt sicker standing in the smoking box of my favourite bar, so this wasn't anything too harsh to deal with. Around the same time, I started getting my first visual distortions. At the beginning, they were very subtle. In the corner of my eye, thinking that I saw something odd or a friend or something that shouldn't be there, but nothing major. These visual distortions slowly evolved, and at around 1.5 hours from consumption I had a full screen weaves going on. The ground would raise to small bumps and people would tilt to the side and so on. From this moment on I didn't speak much really, although I felt I had really an awesome lot to say, perhaps partly due to the cannabis consumption too. I just couldn't find words or spell them out right. If I concentrated, I could go for, yeah, I feel fine, and I just wouldn't be able to speak anymore after that. The sounds and sensory system were still rather fine, and I would also see odd waves of lights going on, and colours were brighter and somehow even deeper. Socially obnoxious and first sound distortions. Time started to be really hard to follow by now. I think it had been around 2 to 2.5 hours from consumption. There was this tent in where many of my friends had gathered together. I occasionally went inside, but I'd soon get bad vibes from some of the people there. The guy who sat next to me suddenly seemed really rude, even though he didn't really do anything. He just felt somehow untrustworthy. Whenever he spoke or even breathed, I'd hear the sound as if it was right next to my ear. I just couldn't take it, it was making my head spin. And plus the tent was dark, many scary things flying on top of it. I'd see bats and ravens in the shadows, which made me a bit jumpy, so I kept going in and out, and eventually I decided that Outworld was better, and so I set on an adventure. The first encounter with an alien life form. I went to walk to the forest now. It had been around 3 hours since my consumption of 2C-E, and I was starting to feel really weird. Sound would be fully disordered. I'd hear the melodies in the air slower, the trance beat even slower. As you know, I was in a psytrance festival and it had 24/7 non-stop trance playing on in the background. A perfect setting. Anyway, in the forest, I didn't get far, since somehow the world just struck me with its beauty. I would see butterflies flying in the air with weird fractals in their wings. I'd see dead flowers come back to life and otherwise common hallucinogenic features. I just sat in the forest for a while, staring at the trees and their colours. I increasingly much realised things I could have been more courteous about. Many small ways of how I could take my environment and friends better to my judgment. I left the forest and went to a water drinking place, and I somehow cut a bit of my skin. Not much, well, it didn't even bleed, I think. But instantly I felt like I'd cut a major vein, and blood just poured all over me. I thought my hand was full of blood, and as I watched it, it seemed to melt away, leaving me a skeleton there. I think I should have panicked, but instead I just thought, oh my, while smiling. I went to lay down a moment in my private tent, but it didn't last long, since the tent was just swirling and turning into fractals and spirals. It made me very dizzy. I decided to pay a quick visit to the big tent of friends, back out, and then to another forest stroll. A loosely shamanistic experience, ego death, and the highest point. Back in the forest this time, I walked even further. I just kept on walking. I saw sort of a tunnel in between the trees, so I just walked through it and it seemed like the world would start to change. It felt really like a place of my own and nobody else's. I didn't encounter anyone in the forest somehow, which is very odd considering the festival had around 5,000 people attending. Occasionally I stopped to watch flowers blooming or butterflies flying around. I didn't really care of anything I felt but seeing the world and its beauty. Sound and sensory systems were really strongly mixed to the visuals as well. The fractals would go deeper with the trance beat, and whenever I looked towards the way the music came from, everything would start to be imbued with life. Trees and flowers grew, and whenever I looked away from the music, I'd just see darkness. Grass and trees would become copies of each other. I'd see eyeballs in between the rows of trees, 2 eyeballs per each gap. It was all very symmetrical, and in many ways I became more natural with my own thoughts and beliefs, a feeling that still persists to this day. I spent a really long time in the forest, sitting and watching. Eventually I walked on and somehow bumbled towards a police car. They wanted me to breathalyse for the alcohol measurement thing, but I couldn't breathe. I tried and smiled and said, I did breath. Anyway, somehow their conclusion was that I was merely drunk, so they left me be. During this process, I actually bit my tongue. I was thinking, I need to bite my tongue to keep sane. Without going to do it, but I ended up doing it anyway. Instantly, it felt like my whole mouth was filled with blood and I'd drown in it. It didn't really bother me though, I could just look past it. I continued on, and at this point I think I reached the absolute fullest effects. I guess this is around the 4th to 5th hour. Everyone would seem like an emotion blur. Hypnoglow got a new meaning too. I really felt one with everything and everyone around me. I could feel that many things that used to matter didn't matter now. A range of things in fields of politics, science, society, etc. Smoothed down, tired. The drugs started to wear off. For the next 3 to 4 hours I could still see visual distortions and hear sound a bit differently, but it was slowly going away. I had an awesome walk to a turnip mustard field, and the sun was just rising and it felt so amazing to witness it. All the white flowers in the pitch started to liven up and sun rays literally danced in the horizon over the golden fields. It was very emotional and pretty. The sound was still slow and it went on its own, but it was starting to go down. At some point I farted hard and I thought I had shit my pants. This was again one of those experiences that felt to me more natural with myself and less interested of opinions of others. I attempted to sleep, but I still couldn't yet, so I walked around and occasionally laid down on the bed. Eventually, after lots of walking around and seeing the fractals and hearing the sound distortions going down, I finally was able to lay down for good and fell asleep. I slept the next 24 hours or so, only occasionally waking up to eat a bit. Quick conclusion, final thoughts. As my first heavy psychedelic experience, it was a very nice one. It wasn't hard on the psyche at all. I did have a few fears like, will this ever stop? But they quickly went away when I went walking and saw the surrounding nature, and it grounded me again. I think the setting for this trip was really perfect, to be honest. One question of interest is, how much did the rather large dose of alcohol and cannabis have to play? They say cannabis usually enhances this kind of experience greatly, but alcohol as a sedative would work against the mildly stimulating effect of the 2C-E, perhaps making the experience a lot easier to handle. To not overthink it. Here's a list of different sound, visual and sensory system effects I got. Fractals. All kinds of fractals. Mainly spirals. Hypnoglow and motion blur. Sound and sensory systems strongly affected the visuals. Melting of objects. Sound extremely slowing down, sounding more repetitive than it was. A brief glimpse of an ego death. A point wherein I didn't really care or feel myself, but not in a bad way at all. Only negative I got was mild nausea, but that passed quite soon. I could honestly say that this seems like the perfect drug for a trip, not lasting overly long and not including strong hallucinations.